Hi, this is Tim Andrus, your teacher for Art History 209. Today I want to give you a little bit of a lecture about the ancient Near East and Egyptian culture, and this will set us up for a discussion of the how we can discuss stylistic differences, especially between ancient Near Eastern and Egyptian art and Greek art, which will be important for your essay on the midterm exam. What we're looking at here currently is a map of the of an area known as Mesopotamia, which now occupies what we call the Middle East. Some of this is composed of the countries of Iraq and Iran, which are very much in the news nowadays. You can see that this area in green, which is Mesopotamia, is uh, borders the north of what is now Saudi Arabia. The areas in green uh, show the areas of fertile river valleys. Not only do we see Mesopotamia, which takes its name from the Greek land between the rivers because it lies between the two rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, which should sound familiar to you from the Bible, from the book of Genesis, because this is where the Bible tells us that the Garden of Eden is. And and this idea that human culture, human origins originates from this area is somewhat confirmed by archaeology and history because the earliest civilizations developed in these areas here in Mesopotamia, or what is also called the Fertile Crescent, and also on the Nile River Valley, which you can see in the lower left. Mesopotamia becomes the what is called the cradle of civilization precisely because of what at least then was the fertility of the land. These rivers would regularly and periodically flood, creating arable, tillable land that was suitable for growing crops. As human culture began to develop out of what we call the Neolithic Revolution, which is the development of agriculture. People moved from a hunter-gatherer culture, which was what we see in the Paleolithic period, into settled communities, stable groups of people living in the same area and cultivating the land, growing crops, and using that to sustain themselves. This gives rise to the earliest civilizations. If we look at that word civilization, we see that the root of it is civil, which is also comes from the Latin word civitas, which is the word for city. So the earliest cities that we see, the earliest civilizations develop here in Mesopotamia, in this area called the Fertile Crescent. As the earliest civilizations develop, we also see that in this same geographic area, there's a lot of political change. You can see that in this map, it lists a number of major groups: the Assyrians at the top, the Akkadians towards the center, the Babylonians, the Sumerians. Sumer is the earliest of these civilizations, and also the Medes and the Persians at the far right, and groups in Anatolia, what is now the area of Turkey. All of these different groups come into this area known as Mesopotamia and continue and take turns dominating it, because the reason is that there's no natural defenses. You can see if you look off to the lower left, you see Egypt is relatively isolated from all of these groups geographically. What that means is that Egyptian culture develops on its own, somewhat independently, and also with a lot of stability, because there's a continuous political organization that lasts for thousands of years and is not really touched by outside influences. Not the case with the area that we now call Mesopotamia, because it's relatively unprotected. These groups can come in and conquer each other one after the other. What's really important about these groups is not only, especially the Sumerians, is not only that they developed the earliest cities, but also that they developed writing. And what we're looking at here is the earliest known form of writing called cuneiform. And cuneiform, you can see, develops out of pictographs. We see this early kind of line drawing in the upper left for a bull's head, and you can see how it's slowly transformed into a symbolic language using this stylized form of mark making. And the reason it looks like that is because they used these stylus, these styli, these pens for making these marks, which were wedge shaped. If you look at the end of the stylus, and remember this is where we got our one of the places where we get our word style from, we see that there's kind of a triangle or wedge at the end of it. This is used for making these kinds of triangular marks in wet clay tablets. So it's a soft clay. They press into it with these styli, make these marks, and then they would bake the clay, fire it, in order to create documents. What we have here is the earliest examples of written language, and with this we have the development of what we call history, properly speaking. We leave prehistory and enter the realm of history. The reason we call this the beginning of the historical period is because we have these written documents that allow us to go back and reconstruct the past. We can know to a certain extent what these people thought, what their beliefs were, what their political organization was like. We do not have this kind of opportunity with prehistoric peoples because they did not leave us any written documents by which we can reconstruct their culture. So this is really the most important development that comes out of these early civilizations, is the development of writing. Keep in mind that a civilization does not necessarily mean that it has writing. It means that they live in cities, and this distinction is evident, especially in Mesoamerican cultures, pre-Columbian cultures, where they had cities, but oftentimes they did not have written language. So those are prehistoric civilizations. Here we have historical civilizations because they have written language. When we look, their religious organization was largely centered around these things called ziggurats, which are essentially man-made mountains. This is the ruin of the Anu ziggurat, now in present-day Warqa, Iraq, which is part of the Sumerian culture. You can see that it's much eroded if you look at it in this, what we call a plan, this top-down view where we're looking at the top of the ziggurat, looking down around it. You can see that it is sort of an informal pyramid. At the top, where it says number 1, you can see there was a temple structure where the main religious activities took place. There was also processional stairs leading up to the top and terraces on another level on top of the ziggurat also. There was no real fixed design for these. Here's the Nana ziggurat, which is probably the largest of all of these. This is about 270 feet high, which, to give you somewhat of a sense of scale, that would be roughly the same height as like a 27-story building. So this is pretty large. And also, again, on top of this, you can see that the ziggurat structure is more or less intact, and you can see the ruins of the temple at the top. The idea here is that these are man-made mountains. The idea in the ancient Near East is that you approach God by going up on top of the mountain. The ancient Greeks believed that their gods lived on top of mountains. Mount Olympus in the Bible, Abraham encounters God in several different instances, by going on top of a mountain. That's where he receives the Ten Commandments. This idea that we approach God by going up on top of a mountain is a universal idea, not only because we think of mountains as being powerful. Let me restate all this. Mainly because of this universal idea that God dwells in heaven, in the sky, and that by building a mountain or going up a mountain, we approach nearer to God. It could very well be that this Nana ziggurat is exactly what the Bible had in mind when it discusses the Tower of Babel, Babel being the same root word as Babylonian civilization. The idea that in the story of the Tower of Babel, people were trying arrogantly, according to the scriptures, to build a structure that would allow them to reach up to heaven and reach God by their own efforts. And God, of course, mocks this idea and curses them with the difference of language, which also corresponds to the different languages and cultural groups that we see occupying this Mesopotamian area. So this becomes a way of understanding or explaining both cultural differences and cultural change within this particular geohistorical group of people. Anyway, as I was saying, though, this idea that we use mountains to approach God is not in itself very surprising. It's a universal idea. We see it, similar kinds of things in Mesoamerican culture, as I mentioned a moment ago. This is the Pyramid of the Sun from Teotihuacan, which is now Mexico City, built by the ancient Aztecs. And they also had a temple structure that would have sat on top of this pyramid. And you can see that people would climb up it, as they still do today, to conduct religious ceremonies, which does not take place here anymore. But furthermore, I should mention that these are solid structures, both the Pyramid of the Sun and also the ziggurats. They would have a temple structure on top where these sacrificial or religious rituals would take place, but the solid foundation of it is the foundation of it, I should say, is solid. There's no structure inside of here. It's not a building that you can enter into. It's a building that you climb up. All of which suggests, again, that these are symbolic mountains. They're man-made mountains that allow us to reach up to God. What's maybe most interesting about the development of these early civilizations is that their art becomes less naturalistic and more abstract. These are a series of votive figures that have been uncovered from a Sumerian temple. You can see that all of these figures are shown with their hands clasped and they have large eyes. All of this is part of their iconography. The idea is that they are praying to the god or the goddess of the temple. They're not idols. They're not meant to be worshipped in themselves, but they stand there taking the place of the person or people who cannot be there themselves to pray because they might have other obligations. And so they set up these statues which represent them praying on their behalf, constantly interceding before the god. Also, because that's why one reason why that's why their hands are clasped, I should say, is because they're praying. But this is also why they have such large eyes, because they are there. They never sleep. They never rest. They are always there. They're always praying. They're always watching and waiting on the divinity. This suggests that art also has a symbolic function, or I should say that the development of civilization and culture is linked to this awareness of this symbolic power of works of art. Just like with the development of language, the symbolic power of language allows us to communicate more thoughts and distinguishes us from other kinds of creatures who do not have this symbolic power of representation. This is one reason why this explains what appears to be a kind of relapse in the history of art. When we look at cave painting, we can see how actually naturalistic it is, how realistic it is, how sensitively these animals are portrayed in the Chauvet cave, both the aurochs in the upper left and the horses in the center and the rhinoceroses in the bottom right. All of those are portrayed with a great deal of sensitivity and accuracy. Whereas when we look at some of these early examples of Sumerian art, by by contrast, they do not seem nearly so naturalistic. It's because there's a greater emphasis being placed on their symbolic power. They no longer represent things literally, but through a kind of abstraction. The other thing that begins to develop is also linked to writing is the idea of narrative in art. This is the stele of Hammurabi, who was an early Sumerian king. And here he is shown receiving the law from God. The bottom of the stele, and a stele is a name for one of these large upright standing stones that has some kind of symbolic meaning. But the bottom of the stele is covered with cuneiform writing, which actually consists of the law code of Hammurabi. What Hammurabi is known for is developing the first written code of law. Hammurabi is shown here on the left. He's the standing figure receiving the law from the god. What's also interesting is that the god is shown seated, he's shown seated, but both his dress and his headdress and the chair he's sitting on all suggest the shape of ziggurats. So what we see here is that his mountainous association is symbolized in the way he's shown. He's also, if he were to stand up, he would be much taller than Hammurabi. You notice that he and Hammurabi meet more or less eye to eye, but the god is shown seated while Hammurabi is standing. What this means is that the more important figure is shown much bigger than the less important person. God is always more important than a human being. So what we see here is an example of what we call hieratic proportion, and we'll come back to see this again in numerous instances. But hieratic, Hieratic, it refers to a kind of symbolic representation of figures where more important figures are shown in a larger scale than less important figures. The other thing that's important about this, though, is that we see the development of narrative in art, that clear ideas are being communicated through visual symbolism. This also differentiates this early art of early civilization from cave painting. In cave painting, there's no clear pictorial space. The images overlap each other. They are painted at different times. They are all painted on the same surface. Here in these early civilizations, we see the development of a ground plane, which is this line that the figures stand on. You can see that in this vase, the image is divided into different levels, which we call registers. On the topmost register, you see a figure at the far left carrying a basket of food in sacrifice to the goddess Inanna, who's shown in the very center. Below that, you can see more figures in the sacrificial procession. They're all carrying baskets of food. In the register below that, you see a line of cattle, and below that, you see crops, corn growing up from out of the ground, wheat. All of these take place in different registers, but each suggests a pictorial space. There's a clear line, a ground line on which all the figures stand, and then they move either right to left or left to right, so that there's a kind of procession or a sense of movement in the image, which all adds up to telling a story, just like we see with the development of cuneiform. We see the idea of a narrative or message being communicated, and communicated clearly, not ambiguously, but very clearly through these works of art. This vase is in 3 dimensions, so you can see the other side here. On the top, we see some of Inanna's attendants, but we can also see, again, there's a bull being brought to her and more of these figures bearing gifts to her. This is the Great Lyre with bull's head, which was found as part of a royal burial. I mentioned last week the importance of lapis lazuli as being this blue mineral that was used to make paint that was precious to a precious stone that was used to make a blue paint used to give honor to the Virgin Mary. Well, this is a very old association. Here in this bull's harp, we see that the beard of the bull, also symbolic of his power and virility. The beard is made out of blue lapis lazuli, and the head is covered with gold leaf, all of which are meant to adorn and enrich this object. On the front of the lyre, so this is kind of like a harp, you realize. On the front of the lyre, we see an inlaid design, which you can see here close up. And again, it divides the image into registers, and that all tell a kind of narrative. And what the narrative here is somewhat unclear, but we can see that there is some clear meaning that is intended with both man bulls and man scorpions at the top and the bottom, suggesting a kind of merging of human and animal elements, and also anthropomorphized animals, these lions and bears and antelope in the bottom three registers are all shown standing up and bearing gifts, also perhaps in some kind of sacrificial procession. In the second register from the bottom, you can see that an animal, a donkey, I think, is actually playing a version of this harp, which is how the archaeologists were able to reconstruct it. They recognized what they were looking at from this very emblem on the picture. I'm going to skip forward here one slide to talk to you briefly about the so-called Stele of Naram Sin. Naram Sin is another of these rulers from Acadia. Here he's shown conquering his enemies, and he's shown in hieratic proportion. He's shown ascending actually over the bodies of his enemies up to the top of the sacred mountain, where there's actually more hieroglyphic writing, and the sun used to symbolize the divinity, the god. Naram Sin has shown himself with a kind of divine or superhuman attributes. He wears this hat, which looks to me like it comes straight out of the Flintstones, actually. He's wearing this hat which has bull's horns on it. And this is meant to symbolize his virility, his power, his ability to conquer his enemies whose bodies he just trods over. In fact, one of them at the top actually commits suicide rather than face the wrath of the horrible, almighty Naram Sin. What's interesting about this, though, is that we see Naram Sin from multiple angles. If you look carefully, you'll notice that we see his head in profile, but we see his torso, his chest, faces towards us. If we look at his right arm, the one holding his spear, we see it in profile. And if we look at his legs, we see them also in profile. So we're looking at Naram Sin from multiple simultaneous points of view. And this is called a composite viewpoint. We'll come back to this because the Egyptians picked up on this composite form of representation and exploited it extensively in their painting, in their art, in their sculpture, in their painting also. What it allows the artists to do is to present the body in the most unambiguous way. It's what we call a conceptual approach to art, not a literal or illusionistic approach to art. If we think about what this means, it's because when we look at a painting which is an illusion, it is a kind of deception. That's what the word illusion suggests, that there's something deceiving about it. But also, if we think about a illusionistic painting, it will only show us one side of the object that we see if we were to encounter it directly in the world. But on the other hand, we know mentally, intellectually, that we're only seeing one part of the object, and that therefore there's more to it than our eyes are showing us. What the artist is doing here is he's showing Naram Sin from multiple points of view in order to make it clear that he is a complete person. If he were to be shown in perspective in such a way that maybe one of his arms were to not be visible or hidden for some reason, it might suggest in the minds of these early artists that that meant that Naram Sin did not have an arm, or he was missing a leg. And rather than deny him any aspect of the completeness of his person, which incidentally would have probably made him unsuitable for kingship, they adopt a what we might consider a distorted way of presentation in order to show him being complete. I'm going to stop this video here because I think I've gone on long enough. I'm going to pick it up in the next installment here briefly to talk about ancient Egypt.